Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you're listening to this podcast. My name is Jamie Dobson. I will be your host today. And as always, I am joined by my partner in crime, Ian.
Hello.
And today we have a very special guest, author of multiple books, more books than we can count. But in the context of this podcast, the cloud native attitude is a pretty important one. Anne, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, this is the first time you've been on the podcast. Have you been listening to the other episodes?
That's really putting me on the spot. Some of them I have, some of them I haven't, I have to admit.
That's okay, because as you well know, and as our audience and listeners know, we are following the book more or less in chapter order. And so we've had a lot of fun with Sam Newman speaking about microservices. We've had Dave Farley speaking about continuous delivery. And of course, today, you're passionate. You're probably your most passionate subject, which is sustainability. And what we're going to do, Anne, is we'd like you to put you back on the spot now. For our listeners, for our audience, what does sustainability in the cloud native context actually mean?
So this is interesting. In a cloud native, I would argue that being cloud native and being sustainable, or building green software, which we sometimes call it, aligning your systems with effectively how to run the majority of the time on renewables like solar and wind that are variably available. The principles of cloud native and the principles of building green software or sustainable software systems are so close you could hardly slide a piece of green paper between them. The principles of both. One of the things was a big question that we had when we first wrote Cloud Native Attitude was, what is cloud native for? And what it's generally for these days are probably the kind of things that Dave Farley talks about when he was on, and Sam talks about when he was talking about microservices. Since Docker, cloud native has really been synonymous with moving fast flow developer as a developer practice. But that wasn't right. It was originally invented. It was originally invented by Google nearly 20 years ago as an operational tool. And it was designed to allow you to build systems at a hyperscale that didn't cost the earth and stayed up. And the principles of cloud native in those days, and I would still say are fundamental principles of cloud native, are minimizing your resource usage in terms of hardware and electricity, which are the key costs for the cloud, for systems that hyperscale systems running effectively, on the internet, and making your systems resilient to outages in the availability or fluctuations in the availability of those resources. So hardware outages, electricity outages or issues. The definition of building green software, in my mind, and we came to realize, me and my co-authors on building green software from O'Reilly came to realize as we wrote it, are that you have to minimize resource usage, you have to minimize hardware usage, minimize electricity usage to produce the same output. So this is not about turning everything off and doing less. It's about doing more, doing the same with less waste, minimizing waste.
So if I paraphrase back, you go ahead, finish your point. Go ahead.
And the other thing that you need to do with building sustainable systems is that they have to be able to run on renewables. And the difference between renewable power and fossil fuel power is fossil fuel power is extremely predictable. It's flat, it's, available at the flick of a switch.
Right.
Supply side response. You manage it on the supply side.
So if I paraphrase back to you then what I think you just said, or my understanding of it, my Jamie brain, if you build a cloud native system correctly, so it's containerized, it has minimum resource use. In other words, if you keep the costs not to minimum per se, but right size for the demand that you're trying to meet, it will be by definition a green setup. Is that a fair takeaway?
That's true, but that's half the story. So yes, that is absolutely true. And that's the beginning of building a green system. But the other half is that you need a system that is resilient to an underlying resource that is variable, which solar and wind are variable, as opposed to fossil fuels, which are flat. The upside of that is they're cheaper, but the downside is that they're less predictable. So a lot of the initial idea of cloud native was you had to build something that provided a solid service on top of a fluctuating availability platform. And that is also the other half of building green software or sustainability.
Right. So let me play this. Let me keep going then. So you build your systems correctly. So by definition, you get proper resource use. However, you then have to somehow cope with the fact that electricity may or may not change price depending on where it's coming from. Mm-hmm. So my next question would be, theoretically then, if Netflix was purely green, only using renewable energy, does that mean they would have to switch off every now and then? Or what would it mean in terms of reliability, the 5 nines that everybody's looking for?
Well, really, what you want is that it's sometimes called a grey out or a brown out or a graceful downgrade. You want to, when electricity is 10 times as expensive because it's fossil fuels, which is what will be happening in the future, and it's dirty. You want to provide a service which is good enough using less electricity, which usually will mean that hardware turns off. Some of the hardware turns off, and you provide a slightly downgraded service. That is not unusual. Netflix do that all the time because they run on another highly variable resource, which is bandwidth. Bandwidth is not, it has never been a flick of a switch fossil fuel supply side kind of resource. It's always fluctuating, and Netflix do things all the time to handle the fact that sometimes there just isn't enough bandwidth to be handled. They use buffering more, they use edge, they use CDNs at the edge, cloud content delivery networks at the end to pre-cache products closer to users. They're very used to.
So I'm gonna bring Ian in at this point because I think I've got one. I hope it's not controversial opinion, but I'm almost reading Ian's mind. And Ian, I want to bring you in because you often say, is this a priority now? So you're in London, you're busy, you've got no money. Does anybody really care about their cloud native setup being green or sustainable? How fantastical is this?
Well, so first I should say I'm struggling to hear Annie on my connection. I'm not sure why, but you're coming through fine, Jamie. So if I interpret your question correctly, does anyone care about this? Well, it is something I've been slightly skeptical of because the whole ESG story has felt to me like a little bit of a story for keep regulators, investors, and governments happy that we're all getting towards targets that are set by the government. But I will say that I've spoken to several banks and people there are really genuinely enthused by this. And also the engineers are genuinely enthused by this. And the best example of this was I was talking to a bank, reasonably sized private-ish bank, and they had beside every project, they had a little factory logo with chimneys. And the more chimneys you had, the worse your software was. And engineers really looked at this and didn't want to be top of that league table of most negative. My skepticism is partly also, the usually men in suits with the real money are actually more concerned about the pennies than.
So your skepticism is not about engineers and the possibility. The skepticism is to do with poor decisions being made at the highest levels of companies.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, has your skepticism changed, Ian, in the last year or two? I mean, you mentioned you'd seen those factories and you've seen a change in behaviour with our customers. And that seems quite quick, actually, doesn't it? A couple of years to go from nobody talking about this to people actually measuring their carbon footprint.
It's coming from bottom and top. I don't think it's coming from the middle. So I think people at the ground level care about it. They say it's a priority for them. And then people at the government level making it a priority as well. I mean, net zero is always in the news as a topic of discussion, and whether we're going to hit it by 2030 and so on. So I think at those levels, it's definitely happening, and it's become a lot more apparent in the last 5 years. Probably.
Well, and as I love to say, if you listen to my podcast, you hear me say this quite often. It's not individual acts, but it's acts of Parliament that change behaviour. So the more we get on top of this from a regulatory perspective, I think the better. Coming back to you then, Anne, have you seen something similar to the continuous chimney deployment setup? Have you seen people measuring the greenness of their software?
Well, I mean, I have, but actually my experience is that's not the best way to make action happen, because it's lovely to keep engineers happy, but the irony is people have a tendency, I think green campaigners have a tendency to really put the brakes on green work because they have a tendency to say, it's all downside to be green. When I go and I present and I give workshops and things for senior folk, I usually position it quite correctly as the aim here is to halve your hosting bill, because you halve your hosting bill and you halve your carbon bill. And you also make your systems more resilient by it being a drive for you to adopt good cloud native practices. You use things like auto scaling, cuts your carbon bills, cuts your hosting bills, and it makes your systems much more resilient. It is good for your business to do this stuff. I do not tell people to just, do things that they're good for the climate but not good for business, because actually they won't scale. They won't happen and they don't scale. The Google motivation for effectively developing green, much more efficient operational practices was to build their business, which, as you say, has issues with the fact that it will successfully, applying green techniques successfully will let you build your business, not shrink your business. But the idea is it will let you grow your business using, your costs and your carbon bill going through the roof. So it's
There's plenty of evidence of this in other domains where Patagonia, the clothing company, famously are a green business, and they can feed into each other. You can be profitable because if you optimize for one thing, you tend to optimize for multiple things. Is this the holy grail we're after? Right-sized cloud costs and infrastructure that drive profitability. In other words, do we have to make the incentives correct for businesses?
Yeah, I mean, the incentives are already there. It is the reason for going cloud native. There's loads of incentives for being cloud native. Being greener is one of them. So that is the thing we need to be clear. It's one of the many incentives for doing cloud native well. If you anything, just going into the cloud and doing it badly is very much not green, which is why you quite often get people saying, yeah, but the cloud isn't green. And the cloud is not necessarily, it's not a given that moving into the cloud will make your systems greener, because it's so easy to over provision in the cloud.
Now, I'm going to hit you both with an economic law, and I'm really curious if you've heard this one before. Now, I know you've both been educated at fantastic universities, so you're quite clever, and Ian's very clever because he's a historian. But have you heard of Say's law? Say was a French economist. So Say's law says that supply creates demand. And now you might think that's bonkers. What do you mean? Well, actually, if you drop a casino anywhere in the world, all of a sudden people start going to it. And I'll be honest, if somebody leaves a can of Stella Artois on a workbench, if the supply of beer goes up, then my demand for it instantly increases. So the more compute we supply, whether that's 20 years ago with more powerful PCs, mobile phones, and nowadays huge computers that we call the cloud, the more supply of something that is available, the more demand often comes to match it. Will we keep creating more data centers, even though we've learned how to sort of build green software? And what impact will that have? Not on the carbon footprint, but for example, on water usage, the use of chips, which might become scarce based on the minerals that are required to build them. And they might become scarce if the Americans and the Chinese fall out over Taiwan. So genuinely, can you have green software as long as data centers are involved?
There is nothing stopping data centers from being a lot greener than they are. And we absolutely need to insist that they are. You've got to remember the majority of data centers at the moment are unoptimized, old, very inefficient, use an awful lot of old technology. Things like networks have got massively, like tenfold more energy efficient over the past 10 years. And yet most data centers are still using the old networks, old infrastructure. There is an awful lot of room for improvement in the way that we build software, we deploy software. I think it's defeatist to say, oh, well, it's all doom and gloom. We're going to just grow and then eventually we'll all, we'll do whatever we choose to do. We don't have to kill data centers with water. It's the easiest way to cool data centers, but it's not the only way to cool data centers. We can make choices. We can make decisions. We should never talk about the future as, oh, well, it has to be just a continuation of the past.
So I guess this is an and thing then, isn't it? We need more green energy to power greener data centers, and we need to learn how to build cloud setups in order to have green software running on it.
Indeed, yeah.
So one of the things people don't realise is, but you both know I'm from the city of Hull, but also William Wilberforce was from Hull, who helped abolish the slave industry in the British Empire. And so what happens is we got dragged every single year to that museum, like every single child in Hull. So the children of Hull accidentally become, minor experts in the abolition of slavery. And one of the key lessons I remember from being a kid is that people like Wilberforce were always accused of being hypocrites because they benefited from the slave trade. Some people had slaves of their own. Of course, Thomas Jefferson famously in the United States. And what we learned as kids was, if the only people who can change a system are the ones who haven't benefited from it, the system will never change. So in a way, we're all hypocrites and we all might face defeatism, and we've all benefited from dirty energy and dirty cloud, but that doesn't mean, if we don't be the change, then who's going to be?
Yes. So I'm going to quote another author who I know you like a lot, Jamie.
Ian Lyle?
Charles Handy.
I do like Charles Handy.
You
Yeah.
do like Charles Handy. He
Yeah.
wrote a really good book that I would really recommend that people read called The Second Curve. And it's about actually, that companies, businesses, countries will succeed off some kind of behavior, and then if they, and eventually that will decline and fall off. That behavior won't last forever. It will have to be replaced by some new behavior. And we've all benefited from the fossil fuels, and society would not be where we are. Whenever anybody says, "Oh well, if only fossil fuels had never been invented," well, we'd all be living in mud huts if that were the case. We're at the top of that curve. We're starting to turn down on fossil fuels, and we need to move on to the new curve, which is renewables, which are better than fossil fuels, but are not like for like replacements.
So Charles Handy sadly passed away in December, just gone. The
Nice.
Second Curve is fantastic. I would recommend any of his books. I've also got on my shelf Václav Smil's A History of Energy or something like that. So he's different to Handy. Smil is very, very difficult to read. He's an academic, but he's thorough. But there is a section in that book, and Ian, I think you'd love this. And he basically says, look, every single system of power comes into existence based on the power system that went before it. And so he shows pictures of human beings carrying coal out of the mines. And before that, horses were dragging wheels around. So you have to use whatever is your present system of power to create the next one.
Well, we've bootstrapped. Smil is a great book. I've read it a couple of times now on my iPad because it's just so information dense. There is so much in there. I really recommend that book to anyone who wants to read it.
Now, I hope Adrian Moat's listening because he likes to call me out when I plug Visionaries, Rebels and Machines. But I've got to do it in this case because it was Václav Smil who gave the 1880s the label the magical 1880s. And he basically says in that book, I don't know if we've read the same book, Ian, because he's a bit of a prolific author, isn't he?
Yeah.
And he says in that book, in a 10-year period, the planet Earth went from being completely dormant, and in just 10 years was pulsating radiation from right across the electromagnetic spectrum because of the telephone, electricity. And so basically there was pre-1880s and post-1880s, and everything that we take for granted today, the foundations for that were laid down in just a handful of years in the magical 1880s. And he has a PDF on that. That's very good.
And also the other story I think about when we're talking about sustainability and the challenges we're talking about today is and I'm sure you'll have a view on this, Annie. Unfortunately, I can't hear your audio very well, so I won't necessarily hear your response. But is the story of how people in London and New York, I think, were so worried about the future of the city because of the amount of horse dung on the street.
Yeah. Yes. No, go on. But I know you're saying, you fear what's going to happen. You don't necessarily know what's actually going to be the problem. Things came along, the car came along, and horse manure disappeared as an issue. People were very, very happy to get rid of their horses and replace them with cars. And things change and you have to adapt to it. I agree. And we at the moment, we think, oh my goodness me, data centers, particularly AI, is causing data centers to suck up all the water and all that kind of stuff. There is no reason why data centers should have to be cooled by water. It's the easiest way, but there are ways that we could have more efficient chips and use aircon to cool data centers and have that aircon powered by solar. It's there is tons and tons of stuff to be done, and there's tons of stuff happening.
So I have at my feet Robert Gordon's Majestic, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And Robert Gordon basically says, look, we've invented three technologies, the phone, electricity, and the car, the internal combustion engine. And until 1971, we were getting benefits from that. But anyway, if you first read this book, you would come to the conclusion Gordon was absolutely obsessed with horseshit. He never stopped talking about it. And it's absolutely visceral. It's disgusting. So at the end of street, the pile of horseshit was up to 2 meters high at the end of street. Below, at foot level, you were kind of walking on a type of sponge, like turf, and that was about 2 to 3 centimeters of compressed horseshit. 20% of all agricultural output in the United States went to feeding horses. And so I often think it is true, it is annoying in London that you can smell diesel, but if people think that our cities are dirtier now than they were at the turn of the last century, they're completely wrong. And the automobile only really became an environmental nightmare when there was enough cars on the road to block the roads and sort of fill up the skies with fumes. And I can tell you in Hull in the 90s, that didn't happen yet, because we used to walk to church or cycle to town and not pass a single car. I remember that vividly because me and my brother Brendan used to deliberately ride on the wrong side of the road. So I think cars only became problematic in, what do we think, last 30 years?
No, I mean,
80s. It started to get bad in the 80s.
I was thinking earlier about this. Was it Say's Law? Reminded me of when they built the M25 and they thought, well, that's going to solve all our traffic problems in London.
Right.
And of course, more people bought cars and went round London on the M25, blocking it up. So the only thing that's really changed the needle there is government activity, right? Taxing more and improving public transport.
Come on in, Anne. You coming in.
I mean, there are two kind of interesting points on that. But there's a desire. People love their cars. We're meeting a demand. People's lifestyles have improved. Cars add a lot of resilience. Whilst it would be lovely if everybody could use public transport, it has enabled in the UK, the public transport has gone really downhill in the past few years. But things haven't ground to a halt because people have cars. And I don't drive. I can't drive a car. I don't have the right eyesight for it. But it does add value. There is demand for it because it improves people's quality of life. And that's always the trade-off. But the other side of that is cars are a hell of a lot more efficient than they used to be. We could not, I mean, cars would have been, if we were driving the cars that we were driving in the 70s, it would be incredibly unpleasant. It would be dirty. It would be expensive. It would be far more intense than modern cars. But modern cars have become more
well, do you know what else? Do you know what else used to happen? Ian mentioned the M25, and as a northerner, we used to watch the news with delight, because the M25 had 50-car pileups all the time, and we'd be like, "What are they doing down there?" And so, not only did cars improve in efficiency, but the safety systems and driving lessons and the signs and the cars themselves with ABS, etc. We don't have 50-car smash-ups anymore, do we?
No, we don't. I think, again, that's a tribute to, well, I suppose it's human beings gradually adjusting to a new technology over 100 years and then getting used to it. And yeah, I think lower. I mean, first of all, people don't drink and drive routinely.
That's true.
And people probably drink less than they used to. Belts, all the other safety thing. I mean, every car looks the same now presumably because of the regulations around how safely they have to be built.
It was the Conservative Minister Barbara Castle who brought in the drink driving rules, and she was absolutely despised. And people would write her letters and say, "You've destroyed our darts team," because people would drive to the countryside, play darts, and they wrote in the letters, I'm very safe. I would only drive if I'd had 6 or 7 pints anymore, and I let my wife drive. And without seatbelts, this was pre-seatbelt legislation. And if you think about that, and then I think within 1 year of that drink drive regulation coming in, I think the deaths from motor cars just went through the floor.
Yeah, and now it's incredibly low. I think it's sort of less than, was it less than 1? I think there was 0 or 1 car death, a pedestrian death in the UK or a while ago. I mean,
it's worse than that.
I mean, that's just pedestrians, but yeah.
It still is vastly better, given the number of cars. It's an area where the number of cars have gone up massively, but the number of deaths have not gone up to match. But that is actually, health and safety is a really good example of an area which has been transformed by government regulation. So that's something that governments have to do.
We're going to switch gears now. So far we've discovered that cloud native setups are effective. We need our data centers to be cleaner, and we need them to be powered by solar. That we've discovered. We've also said that if hypocrites were not allowed to change the system would never get changed. So we're all hypocrites. We've all benefited one way or another. In the case of William Wilberforce, from slavery, and in our case, from cheap and dirty energy. So we've learned a few things. And we've learned about regulation, how it's useful to change behaviour for drunk drivers and for parts of the environment. We learned a little bit about horseshit. We've touched horseshit momentarily. So Robert Gordon would be happy. Now, switching gears, Anne, we'd like to ask you, especially for the benefit of our listeners, practically, quickly, how do they start? If you're a manager, where do you start? If you're an executive, where do you start? And if you're just a lowly computer programmer, what can you do in your big organization to affect positive change?
Well, the place I strongly recommend that everybody starts is, even if you're cloud native or you're not cloud native, either way, you do a resource. You analyze what's going on in your data center. You look for ways to cut your hosting costs, and that is usually all about: is there more you can do for right sizing? Can you turn off systems that really aren't doing anything for you anymore? Maybe people aren't watching out for it. Quite often that falls into a security review, because systems that are sitting there running, doing things, but you're not really watching and you don't really caring about anymore, and you're not keeping patched, are a security hole for your systems. So do a thriftathon exercise. Look for ways to cut your hosting bills, because that will cut your carbon bills as well. So that is where to start. Know what's going on in your data center and try and eliminate as much waste as possible.
That sounds easy for two reasons. Number one, you'd get instant results, but multiple people would like that. The bean counters would like to reduce their costs. The nerds in the team would like to optimize stuff for less usage. So that feels like a bit of a winning zone to sort of start with.
Oh, absolutely. And when I talk to CEOs, C-suite folk about this, they go, yes, we'd want to do that. And quite often they'll instantly kick off green projects. And it kind of gives you a double win, because you're saving money, you're making the system more secure, and you are helping to save the planet at the same time.
And not to mention, you would keep the narcissists happy. Let's not kid ourselves. Most businesses are run by charming narcissists who, when the winds change, they act like they were always going to move in that direction anyway. So these bastards can put green on their CV. Okay. So we've even, in this situation, we found a place for the nerds, the bean counters, and the narcissists. Very good. Right. What else? Point two. What else could they do?
Point two. And then once they've done that, they need to start thinking about, so when you do that, usually that's a regular manual exercise. Swap your a hackathon for a thriftathon every now and again, and go through and resize things and minimize what's going on, try and eliminate waste from your data centers. The next thing you have to do is look for places where you can automate some of that stuff. So it's not happening once every 6 months or once every year. It's happening once every moment, every minute, it's like, but what can you automate that can help you keep your systems right sized, which is, so things like auto scaling, using instance types that automatically right size for you, like burstable instance types. Look for places where you can use spot instances. My favorite cloud native tool. Everything you can do in a spot instance is good.
So I hate to ask this question, because I sometimes think tools become too big a focus, but are there any tools out there that just make sense? Like, I don't know, a fuse fuses in plugs just make sense because people don't get electrocuted. Are there any simple tools? So spot instances are one. Is there anything else our listeners should be looking at, or anything else they should be looking at?
Well, it's always worth looking at, in the cloud, it's always worth looking at what the cloud providers are pushing as their tools that are effectively, they're saying these are going to be the green platforms of the future that are going to help you get greener without you having to do all the difficult work. So have a look at the sustainability pillar, architectural pillar documentation for your hyperscaler, for your cloud, and see what they're talking about. So quite often they'll be talking about spots. They're often talking about serverless, because that's something where over time they will continually rewrite it to make it more efficient without you having to do the code efficiency stuff, which is really hard. But if nothing else, talk to your hyperscaler and say you care about this stuff, and that you're reading their sustainability pillar and you're acting based on it, and they'd better keep it up. Just because they said that the serverless was going to be a green platform for them, are they sneaking away from that secretly? You've got to keep their feet to the fire.
Do you know, and I suppose, where does the motivation come from to do all of this? About 3 years ago, I was with a really big company here in London, and they talked about sustainability, and they brought it up. And I asked them later, I was like, where is this coming from? Because I thought, it'll be some bullshit regulation, or they need to show their boss that they're doing something green. And the fella told me his teenage daughter was asking him, Dad, what are you doing? And it reminded me of that poster, right, of a person who didn't contribute to the war effort in the Second World War. And then they'd be asked later, Dad, what did you do in the war? And the person was full of shame. And I remember thinking, wow, that felt like a sea change to me, when our kids are asking us, What are you doing to help make a better world for us lot? Now, I don't think any kids listen to this podcast, but I suppose that peer pressure thing and that shift in I don't know, outlook is a positive thing as well, isn't it?
It is. It is. The difficulty with having that desire is then knowing how to turn it into useful action. And quite often people think they try to leap right to the end. They go, oh, I'll have to rewrite my systems in Rust or C, and then I'll get out of business if I did that, which is true, almost certainly for most enterprises. So I won't do anything at all. When in fact, the biggest win is just cleaning up waste in your data centers where you get loads of benefits, knock-on benefits. And that is the kind of embracing cloud native operations is a win across your business, and every enterprise should be doing it. And one of the wins is being green.
I think one of the biggest challenges I've seen in the last 20 years is managers and leaders of businesses are so overwhelmed they don't know where to start. On the weekend, we were driving somewhere and Michael Jackson's Man in the Mirror came on. And I know it sounds like a cliche, but I'd still say to people, if you can't change your company, just change your department. And if you can't change your department, change your team. And if you can't do that, just change your own behaviour and start from there and then grow outwards. Because if every single one of us took care for our own behaviour and the handful of people around them, a lot of these issues would go away. So I think that's real leadership. But there are no quick wins. There's no glorious ride into the sunset. So this is why the narcissists don't like to do the incremental, thankless, effortful tasks that are required.
No, argue against that. I think that there's the biggest quick win is just cleaning up your data center. That's commonly we see that 30%, 50%, even 60 or 70% reduction in carbon emissions instantly by just.
So you think, yeah, exactly. So you think there is a quick win that is impactful? Yeah. Yeah, fair. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, that's a fair point. Okay, so I guess that must be the biggest takeaway of today. You have to do this stuff and do this first. Clean up your mess. You'll get a big win, and then tune in next year when we'll tell you what to do next.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned about people's kids. You're always telling them to clean up their bedroom. You need to clean up your data center.
Is there a next step, Anne? After people have cleaned up the data center, is that job done, or what would come next?
I mean, the next thing is then the rest of the cloud native stuff. So automating it effectively. The next bit is automating keeping your bedroom clean, rather which is something you can't get. You always have to get your kids to manually clean their bedrooms every week or whatever, but you can automate the cleaning of your data center. So you really have no excuse for letting it get messy.
So recently, because I'm reading so many books, for my own work and for LinkedIn and all of that, I can't actually squeeze them all in. So I've reluctantly started listening to audiobooks. And my new process is I listen to the audiobook, and if it's not complete rubbish, I'll then buy the normal book, and I'll do a combination. I'll go to the gym and listen to a chapter, and then I'll read a chapter. But what happens is I fall asleep on them, and then I don't know what's reality anymore. So about 6 months ago, I was out walking, and all of a sudden a thought hit me. And the thought was Kirk Douglas in Spartacus. He was crucified, and the Romans were so angry, they did a chain of crucifixes all the way from the boot of Italy to Rome. And I was like, no, they didn't do that. That's impossible. There wouldn't be that many people in the country to crucify, would they? And sure enough, that they did do that. And I'd fallen asleep to Tom Holland's Dominion whilst listening to the story of Spartacus and this huge column of crucifixions that the Romans had chucked up as a deterrent. Anyway, I'm going somewhere with this story. The other thing that seeped into my subconsciousness was a child's bedroom is like entropy. You need to constantly pour energy into the system to keep it clean, constantly. And the second you don't put it in, boom, chaos and disorder emerges. And I suppose that's what you're talking about with these data centers, right? This is a very long way around of saying I agree with you. If you don't put constant energy into keeping your data centers trim and clean, a bit like a yard or a bit like a kid's bedroom, it is going to get decluttered quickly, and then it's going to become unsustainable.
Well, that makes us children and our data centers the playroom, right? Which is
does.
Seems quite apt.
And the trouble with the cloud is it can become like giving someone an endless bedroom where they just keep shoving all the rubbish into the corner. So, but going into the cloud can be green because there are loads of tools to help you do a better job. If you're in the cloud, they'll call you back to the sustainable architectural pillars again. But it's also like giving everybody a limitless bedroom, so you can accumulate one hell of a lot of rubbish in there.
Crazy. I mean, it's funny because the cloud began with that idea. If we had an infinitely large computer, what could people in their bedrooms create? That was it. That was a part of the design rationale. Okay, we are now coming to the end. Now, usually, Anne, I do these great summaries at this point. Where do I begin on this one? We started with the definition of what is green software, what is sustainable, and that quickly got us onto these three pillars: a sensible architecture that is right sized to the resources it uses, clean data centers because right now they're really inefficient, and solar power. Those three pillars kind of would together combine to allow us to build green software. Is that a fair summary?
It is. And I'm going to say, and start with saving money. Just start with saving money.
Yeah, right, exactly. And that led us to our next question. We got to that next question, but only after talking about slavery, horseshit, Wilberforce and Jefferson. But we eventually got to the question, what's the first thing I can do? Try to save as much money as you can, because cloud usage or data center usage is almost equivalent to energy usage. Is that correct?
It's very similar. I mean, it's not, it's use your head. If someone just gave you a 50% discount for being an early trialer or something, then obviously that is not a carbon discount. But if it's like for like, if you can run your systems by tuning them and getting rid of over provisioning on fewer machines and less electricity, that's just a pure carbon saving.
Oh, you're in dangerous territory there, asking our listeners to use their heads. Very, very dangerous territory. Okay, so therefore we have looked at what it all means. We've talked about regulations and we've provided a next step for people to follow. That therefore brings us to the end of this podcast. It's been fantastic to have Anne Currie on, prolific author, The Cloud Native Attitude, Building Green Software, and an amazing run of science fiction books. Anne, when is the next one coming out?
Well, I am 3/4 of the way through the first draft of the conclusion of the Panopticon series, book 9, and the conclusion of the Panopticon series. So I'm hoping this year. I'm hoping maybe Christmas.
It's not the beginning. Is it the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? That's always the question when you finish a long series. Is it the beginning?
How to finish a series? Well,
yeah.
Okay, good. So if anybody's interested in finding out more about Anne's work, you can follow her on LinkedIn, follow her on Amazon, see all the books she's been writing. So thank you, Anne.
Thank you very much for having me.
Anytime. Thank you, Ian, my co-pilot, for bringing in your stories about the factories. I enjoyed that one. I'll be picking your brains about that later.
Thanks, Jamie.
And all of you listeners can tune into the next time when we'll be talking about, I can't quite remember what, I need to check the book. But until then, take it easy and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.